Let's turn quickly to Genesis chapter 7, and our study is actually in 8, but what we're going to do for those that were, missed, we're going to do a summary by showing a video clip here in a minute that was actually part of a CBS special in 1993. I believe it was 1993. CBS ran a special on Search of Noah's Ark, and their researchers in preparation for that special asked, is there a theory out there that explains how the flood of Noah could occur? And this is back in 1993. Their technical people said, yeah, this Dr. Walt Brown, who had written a book called In the Beginning, Compelling Evidence for Creation and the Flood. Dr. Walt Brown's theory is a credible theory in their view, and one that we can feature in the CBS special. So what you're about to see is a little portion of the clip, which is a review of what we've discussed, which is where did the water come from to flood the whole earth? If the earth was flooded, the water came from somewhere, it had to go somewhere. We've covered where the water came from, and just as a summary of our study, chapter 7, verse 11 of Genesis, in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, the 17th day of the month, on that day, all the fountains of the great deep were broken up and the windows of heaven were opened, that there was great amounts of water under the earth. There was a cracking of the crust, per the theory, that would have looked like a fountain as the crack circumnavigated the globe, and we're going to find out today 46,000 mile long crack circumnavigated the globe, and the water underneath the crust would have looked like a huge fountain causing global rainfall. Then to verse 22, all in those whose nostrils was the breath of the Spirit of life, all that was on the dry land died. So he just didn't kill the fish, because fish live in water. I'm sure a lot of fish died because of the things that were happening, but there was survival of the fish. But everything on earth that was living that wasn't in Noah's Ark died, is what the Bible says. All that was on the dry land died. So he destroyed all living things which were on the face of the ground, both man and cattle, creeping thing and bird of the air. They were destroyed from the earth. Only Noah and those who were with him in the ark remained alive, and the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days. And so it rained 40 days, 40 nights, but the waters kept on going up. And at the end of 150 days, all land is covered and Noah's boat is floating. There would have been global tidal waves because of the lunar effect, unobstructed by land. There would have been those kind of things happening. And then our study today goes into chapter 8, where it says, then God remembered Noah and every living thing and all the animals that were with him on the ark, and God made the wind to pass over the earth, and the water subsided. The fountains of the great deep and the windows of heaven were also stopped, and the rain from heaven was restrained. So God said he stopped those waters that were coming out from the great deep, and by restraining the waters coming from the great deep, it also restrained the global rainfall, and the dry land ultimately appears as you go through chapter 8. So, with that, as a summary of where the water came from, underneath the crust, fountains of the great deep, covered a relatively flat earth, let's look at the video.
We can see on our planet 17 very strange features which can now be systematically explained as a result of a cataclysmic global flood whose waters erupted from subterranean chambers with an energy release exceeding the explosion of 10 billion hydrogen bombs. This explanation shows us just how rapidly major mountains formed. It explains the coal and oil deposits, the rapid continental drift, why on the ocean floor there are huge trenches and hundreds of canyons and volcanoes. It explains the formation of the layered strata and most of the fossils, the frozen mammoths, the so-called ice ages, and major land canyons, especially the Grand Canyon. The pre-flood Earth probably had only one very large supercontinent covered with lush vegetation. There were seas and major rivers. The mountains were smaller than today's, but perhaps 9,000 feet high. According to the hydroplate theory, the pre-flood Earth had a lot of subterranean water, about half of what is now in our oceans. This water was contained in interconnected chambers, forming a thin spherical shell, about half a mile thick, perhaps 10 miles below the Earth's surface. Increasing pressure in the subterranean water stretched the crust just as a balloon stretches when the pressure inside increases. failure in the crust began with a microscopic crack which grew in both directions at about 3 miles per second. The crack, following the path of least resistance, encircled the globe in about 2 hours. As the crack raced around the Earth, the overlying rock crust opened up like a rip in a tightly stretched cloth. The subterranean water was under extreme pressure because of the weight of the 10 miles of rock pressing down on it. So the water exploded violently out of the rupture. All along this globe-encircling rupture, fountains of water jetted supersonically, almost 20 miles into the atmosphere. The spray from this enormous fountain produced torrential rains, such as the Earth has never experienced before or after. The Bible states that all the fountains of the great deep burst open on one day. And it describes these events about 5,000 years ago, which we can now tie together scientifically. Some of the water jetting high above the cold stratosphere froze into supercooled ice crystals and produced some massive ice dumps, burying, suffocating, and instantly freezing many animals, including the frozen mammoths of Siberia and Alaska. The high-pressure fountains eroded the rock on both sides of the crack, producing huge volumes of sediments that settled out of this muddy water all over the Earth. These sediments trapped and buried plants and animals, forming the fossil record. This erosion widened the rupture. Eventually, the width was so great that the compressed rock beneath the subterranean chamber sprung upward, giving birth to the mid-oceanic ridge that wraps around the Earth like the seam of a baseball. The continental plates, the hydroplates, still with lubricating water beneath them, slid downhill away from the rising mid-Atlantic ridge. After the massive, slowly accelerating continental plates reached speeds of about 45 miles per hour, they ran into resistances, compressed, and buckled. The portions of the hydroplate that buckled down formed ocean trenches. Those that buckled upward formed mountains. This is why the major mountain chains are parallel to the oceanic ridges from which they slid. The hydroplates, in sliding away from the oceanic ridges, opened up very deep ocean basins into which the floodwaters retreated. On the continents, each bowl-shaped depression or basin was naturally left brimful of water, producing many post-flood lakes.
The demonstrations you have just witnessed of a massive worldwide catastrophe in antiquity supports the biblical story of the deluge in every detail.
Again, at the time, in 1993, he was saying that it jettisoned, the pressure was there to jettison 20 miles up into the atmosphere, but since then, as we discussed, supercritical water temperature would have had the energy to actually send things deep into space and make the comets and the asteroids, as we've discussed. So if the supercritical waters of the great deep erupted with enough force to send rock, water, and debris into space, because this is a picture from Dr. Brown's book, and there is the energy to send the debris into space. And so if that happened, then could this be why? If you look at that moon picture, you can see when we look at the moon, there's one face always pointed towards us. The other face we never see. On this, they've taken pictures, they've sent a spacecraft up, and if you look to the right of the center of the moon picture is the backside of the moon that we never see. To the left is the part of the moon that we always see. When we look up at the moon, you see that face of the moon, those dark areas. What we now know those are huge lava flows on the face of the moon, and has given it really a smoother appearance than the backside of the moon, which is cratered. So if you look at this, you can see that the near side of the moon, what we look at, is somewhat has these blotchy areas which are not found on the other side. Huge lava flows not found on the other side. Seismic equipment that our astronauts have left on the moon that have been reactivated show all the earthquakes happen on the near side of the moon. And so the theory is, the theory has it that the Earth spit at the moon. Spit at the moon huge rocks and chunks and debris that by the time it's coming crashing in at thousands of miles an hour into the lunar surface, it would have created huge magma flows. And so when you look up as Christians, I do believe, based on this theory that I've been researching for years, all the evidence is supporting it, That when we look up and we see the face of the moon, we're watching the lava flows that occurred from the Earth. Now, the evolutionary scientists have a very difficult time explaining why the front side of the moon has been so impacted, because if it was some kind of asteroid or meteor shower that went through, any meteors heading for the moon, what are they going to hit on the near side of the moon? They're going to hit Earth. Earth is a natural shield to the near side of the moon unless the Earth spit at the moon, unless the Earth is the source of what was happening to create that difference that we see in this slide. Now, now we're going to shift to another understanding, and this is one of the most important understandings for all your children that go to an evolutionary geology class. It is a fact that all over the Earth there are layered strata. And one continent has the same layered strata as another continent in many cases. Not all cases, but in many cases the same. So the evolutionists will say over millions of years, some volcano lays down a strata, some this lays down a strata, and these strata are found all over the Earth, and there's also layering of fossils all over the Earth. So that's why they came up with this evolutionary millions and millions of years of slow laying down of sediments in animals to create the fossil record. Well, there's an alternative to that idea. So I'm emphasizing the sediment layer here. It's not to scale because the crust was 10 or more miles thick. There's still a thin layer of subterranean water underneath the crust, and the entire Earth is flooded. Now, the water is still leaking out from underneath the crust, and if you could look underneath the water, the crust would have been fluttering. There would have been a continuous earthquake going on every single plate of the Earth. Every single crustal plate on the Earth would have been having an earthquake. As the crust was fluttering, the fossils would have been laid down, density layers would have been laid down, there would have been this sedimentary layer distributed globally as it was shaking, and the sediments were piled up into these different density layers because of a phenomena called liquefaction. Dr. Brown has a chapter on liquefaction, and what he explains is this is a concrete tank that had been sitting in the ground in Japan when they had an earthquake. And it was an earthquake when there was a lot of water in the ground. And the shaking of the ground took this low-density tank and moved it up and popped it right out of the ground. Shifting to another idea, how do we know this is true? In the 1950s, when we were doing extensive oceanography, mapping the ocean floor as a country, actually the whole world was getting into the idea that when he saw this ocean ridge, those arrows are pointing to a continuous ocean floor mountain. You can't see it because it's underneath the ocean, but it's this 46,000 mile long mountain range. And it's called the Mid-Oceanic Ridge. When you're talking about the portion of the ridge in the Atlantic, it's the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. So you can notice that the west side of America right here is running over this ridge that was lifting up in the Pacific. And what we're going to, telling you what I'm going to be telling you is that this ridge generally coincides with where the crack was, according to Dr. Brown's theory. That the crust was sitting on the mantle, the crust broke. The crust eroded into a wide V, and the pressure imbalances caused the crust to push on the mantle, and the mantle bowed up into that crack, and as it lifted up into the crack, the continents went away from that crack and then came to a crashing halt. The first place that the ridge rose, according to Dr. Brown's theory, is right here along the Atlantic. That's where, and that would have been closer to the equator with the way the Earth was spinning at the time, and so it would have bowed up and the continents would have been moving away from that crack. And because the crack was growing all over the Earth, it was slowly lifting as the Mid-Oceanic Ridge was growing all over the Earth. It was growing in elevation as the crack was widening. When it made the big pop in the Atlantic Ocean started to come up and the continents started to move away, that would have removed the continental crust weight, which would have caused it to lift up even more, causing the continents to move further away and faster as they're moving away, causing the mantle to move up even more. And when it moves up in the Atlantic, it has to go down somewhere else, we're going to see. And so it's coming up in the Atlantic, it has to go down someplace else. That's creating a sliding effect of the continents that we will look at here in a minute. But you can see, I'm again telling you what I'm going to tell you. We'll go back and look at this. But right here, this is what made the Olympic and Cascade Mountain Range. America sitting on a hydroplate, which is like oil. It's sitting on the water. The hydroplate of America is sitting on the water still underneath the crust. When you lift up one side, slides to the other because the water was there, came to a crashing halt on the Pacific, the rising Pacific Ridge, and in doing so, created our Olympic mountain ranges according to the theory. So, Dr. Brown, we're always deceived by looking at a map of the ocean floor and the earth, because when you take a globe and you try and lay it out two-dimensionally, it puts everything into distortion, as you probably learned in school. What Walt Brown did is he took the map of the ocean floor, made it accurate to a globe, and then he made the North and South American continent, including their continental shelves, and the European and African continental shelves, and made it accurate to the shape of the globe. And this is what you end up with when you bring them up to the crack. Doesn't that look like a nice fit? The evolutionists have a different take on it, but it really doesn't make sense. But what does the ridge on the ocean floor have to do with the crack and the crust? How could the 46,000-mile ridge form? Again, as we've mentioned before, this is the crust here pushing down on the basaltic mantle area with a subterranean chamber. Everything is balanced because the crust is pushing down evenly all over the earth, putting 62,000 pounds per square inch. If it was 10 miles thick, it was about 62,000 pounds per square inch all over the mantle. And you have to understand that rock doesn't seem like it's a very good spring, that it doesn't have any springiness to it. But everything, when it's under 62,000 pounds, it can be springy. So the mantle's being pressed, and so the mantle is under such intense pressure that if you could remove that pressure, it would act like a spring and want to come out wherever you can remove the pressure. So everybody follow that, I hope, because there's some geologists that work for AIG that don't understand that and say that the mantle can't become a spring. Everything acts like a spring. It might not move very far with a piece of pressure, but when you put 60,000 pounds, it'll become a spring. So, at the end of 150 days, this is a situation. That crack has eroded into a V shape, and these crustal pieces are pushing down on the mantle with much greater pressure than the water is pushing down on the mantle. And you have to think these crustal pieces on each side, in the case of North America, which is currently 3,000 miles wide, before it moved west and crashed and buckled up with mountain ranges, let's say, and I'm not saying this is what it was, but let's say it was 5,000 miles wide. So you have a 5,000 mile wide continent pressing down on the mantle. And you have this crack, which Dr. Brown estimates was about 800 miles wide. So the crushing of the crust down on the mantle is like a hand on a tube of toothpaste. And it's pushing. And the blue here in this diagram, this V area, is like the screwed off cap of the nozzle of the toothpaste tube. And so the crust is squishing and the toothpaste is getting ready to come out, which is the mantle. The mantle is the toothpaste, the hand is the crust, and it's wanting to come out through that hole. And it's represented by bricks. If you put a spring underneath a brick, and you widen the bricks away from the spring, ultimately it will pop up like that. Hopefully everybody could figure that out. And then the detractors of Dr. Brown, even a geologist for answering judge says, it's not a spring. Yes, it is a spring. The mantle wants to do that. It's a simple physics fact, which was demonstrated when they were doing this mining, this limestone quarry in Yorkshire, England in 1887. They kept digging deeper and deeper and deeper, and pretty soon they're starting to cut the bottom of the floor of the quarry, and the bottom of the floor starts exploding up into the workers' faces, because the wall was so heavy compared to the floor that the shale was wanting to get out from underneath the wall and go to the low pressure area. And so then the low pressure area was bowing up the quarry floor, and they couldn't quarry down anymore because the limestone was exploding as they were trying to go down any further. The detractors will say, but Walt, the wall is going down. You're saying America lifted up and started moving west, but the wall is going down. Well, that's where you lose it in the analogy here. If you had that wall going for another 5,000 miles out, and you had the pushing, somewhere where your hand is pushing on the toothpaste tube, you're making an indentation, you're making a lower area. And on the Earth, that lower area was on the Pacific side. And so you're squishing the mantle's popping up and lifting up one side of the continent as the continent moves up. The next is the physics behind these forces are demonstrated also by, and Walt has I've seen him in a seminar that he gave. This is a mattress. The white is like a mattress that's pressed into this box to give it a springiness, to demonstrate the springiness of the mantle. These are like little, on top of here, these are like little slabs of heavy wood, and if you lay them all on the mattress, it goes flat, and it looks flat. And then what he demonstrates is he pulls off the center piece of wood, nothing happens. Pulls off one on each side of the center, nothing happens. Pull off another one on each side, boom, it just pops up in the exact shape of this 46,000-mile mid-oceanic ridge. But you'll notice that there's a problem here with this demonstration too. That's a void space. Now the mantle can't pop up with a void space. Something has to fill that space. And the place that it was filled up from was the other side of the Earth. It was from the Pacific side that was providing the mantle, pushing down on the mantle to provide the uplifting of the mid-oceanic ridge. There's one place that's the center. If you look at the center of the ocean trenches of the Earth, the trenches are in the Pacific. The exact center of the trench area is exactly on the opposite side of where the Atlantic ridge would have started to rise. When the ridge first started coming up, material has to come from inside the Earth someplace to allow that ridge to go up. And without getting too technical here, it had to come from someplace, and material started to move in the Earth. By the way, when we're talking 4,000-mile radius of the Earth, from the center of the Earth out to us is 4,000 miles. We're talking almost the skin of an apple is the crustal area. But something has to move into that place. You can't have the void space. And because of the way the Earth was, and possibly the crust was a little bit thicker in the Pacific, it provided the extra push to push down the mantle to create it to come up over in the Atlantic to then cause these continents to move towards the Pacific. Does that help? Inner Earth material would have been moving towards the rising Atlantic. There are trenches because the crustal piece in the Pacific would have been bowing down as the Atlantic was rising, and there are thousands and thousands of volcanoes on the floor in the Pacific, and Dr. Brown theorizes this is how the very hot inner outer core, they call it the outer core, the very center of the Earth they know is solid, surrounded by the inner solid Earth is what's called the liquid outer core, followed by the mantle, followed by the crust. And Dr. Brown theorizes that the heat of this material moving to the rising ridges caused the viscosity, it added so much heat that actually other settling took place because of the different density materials and created a massive melting of the inner Earth, as well as creating even the magma that we see coming out on the Earth today. Also, and many people are, Walt, you must be wrong. Look at how far away Asia is from the crack in the Pacific, and so where's that crust? Well, in that area, the crust went down, and it's the ocean floor. And by the way, science has done some ocean floor investigation over in the western part of the Pacific Ocean. They dig down. They expect to find what they find in all the other oceans of the world, basaltic type material. There's crustal material, which is granite, and then there's mantle ocean floor material, which is basaltic. What they find when they dig down in the western Pacific is they find crushed granite. The lava that comes out has granite in it. And so they're amazed by that. So when it lifted in the Atlantic, and by the way, see it's labeled flank rifts, axial rifts, and then there were fracture zones, because if you take rock and all of a sudden it bows up and goes into tension, it's going to create ridges. It's going to break and pop those cracks on the top. Those features are for the entire 46,000-mile length of the ridge. It proves that it came up in tension. And then it would have been a zipper. The first place it came up, it would have zipped from both sides, and it would have also been, as it was rolling up this way, it would have created fracture zones perpendicular to the axis. And that's what you see on the entire length of the mid-oceanic ridge. And this is all happening underwater at first, and the continents start taking a ride. Dr. Brown theorizes that they got up to the speed of 45 miles an hour. And again, Dr. Brown, he's an MIT mechanical engineer, doctorate, just using some basic assumptions. If you put mass in motion, what's going to happen? Well, when we watch train wrecks on TV and you sit there and go, wow, those heavy trains piling into a wall. Wow, that's a lot of energy, a lot of damage. Imagine the trillions of tons involved with a 10-plus mile thick continent heading west, going 45 miles an hour. When it runs out of its lubrication, or it runs into something, there's going to be some major changes that occur to those crusts. So the ridge grew. North and South America started moving towards the west. Europe and Africa to the east, both were lubricated with the remaining water, and off they went. As these forces of momentum are building up, the continents are coming crashing, running out of lubrication. South America, if you look here, the Andes mountain range, which goes right along with the leading edge of the movement, the Andes mountain range, probably ran out of lubrication, ran out of water, is crushing down along on the mantle, and boom, starts lifting up and folding on itself. America ran into the Pacific Ridge, creating the Olympic Cascade Mountain Range from north to south, the Rocky Mountains, or a few cars back in the big train wreck, the Rocky Mountains bow up. A few more train cars back, the Appalachian Mountains bow up. And everything's coming to crash, and everything is moving towards the Pacific. Now, look at that. This is a mountain range in Canada. I think every Christian student should take this picture to their geology class, their evolutionary geology class, because this one picture destroys evolutionary layer theory to smithereens. Because layers do not lay down like that in folded layers. In other words, this picture really looks obvious that at one time those layers were horizontal, and while they were still soft, because this is solid rock now, while they were still soft, somebody took them and crunched them together and folded them. And this is not made up, that's real. Well, what in the world could fold soft before solidifying what is now sedimentary rock? There is no answer except the hydroplate theory. Everything has just been freshly laid down. It's underwater. The carbon associated with the carbon dioxide coming out of the fountains of the Great Deep had not been the cementing agent of this sedimentary rock yet. It was still not solidified, just like it takes a while for concrete to dry through the same cementing process. And so these layers have been laid down, they're soft. They're riding on top of the average thickness of sediments on the earth at the time was, now today is a mile thick, sitting on top of North American continent. North America goes for a ride to the west, comes to a crashing halt. The momentum, with all those layers laid down horizontally, the momentum says, I'm still going. Boom, 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 folds it up. Does everybody follow that? To demonstrate this is our sedimentary hydroplate. This is North America. And this guy down here is the mantle that it's going running on. And now I can lift this up pretty high, and it doesn't want to, that high. It doesn't want to take a ride because of the friction that's there. Now, evolutionary scientists say that all the mountain ranges were by the slow subduction process, a mantle going down, inches a year, pushing. Well, see, if I were to try, that's like saying I can push this sedimentary rock with a straw. Can I push this with a straw? No, the straw would crush. Within 10 miles into land, anything that's pushing on granite crust, 10 miles in, you cannot transfer that force because you'd be crushing it. There's too much friction of the crust sitting down on top of the mantle. Does everybody kind of follow that? You can't move something without that something being strong enough. But if North America was lubricated with water underneath and the mantle popped up, it's going for a ride because there's no friction. The water's keeping the friction until it runs out of water or runs into something. This is now the earth flooded with water, and the ground is just barely flooded. You have to remember that the Bible says that all the land was flooded at 22.5 feet. The highest piece of land was 22.5 feet underwater. So, when the crust started moving, if this crushes, then that means that I have more of a place for water to go into, because the land is going to crush up and the water is going to have room to go into, and the water level will go down. Does everybody follow that? And so then the dry land appears. As the continent, which was, let's say, 5,000, I don't know that that was accurate, when North America comes to a crushing halt, thickening the crust, creating mountain ranges, flipping over pieces of crust and sedimentary layers, which we see all over the place. Uplift, vertically uplift, huge sedimentary layers that were laid down horizontal, like in my hometown of Colorado, west of Denver, there's a place called Red Rocks. Huge sedimentary layers lifted up, crushed. And we can't use water in here. Now what we're going to do is show, and what we're going to do is have the water go in here. We're going to show that it's all flooded, drain it into a bucket, and then lift the bucket up, have the water lubricated, and find out that you don't have to lift it very high at all before it to take a ride. So pretend I'm not lifting it very high, but then we go up like this. And if we had been flooded before when we put the water in, our shoreline's here, and here's the Olympic Cascade Mountain Range. And I have crust that's above water. Does everybody follow that? So in the question of where did all the water go? Well, all the water ran off into the widening ocean basins because the continents were crushing like this. You had a 10-mile deep. For every mile that crust narrowed, because it's building up into mountains, that's a 1-mile thick, 10-mile deep area for water to run off into. What does the Bible say? God remembered Noah and every living thing and all the animals that were with him in the ark, and God made a wind to pass over the earth, and the water subsided. I know some people that went over to watch the Kingdom and, be destroyed. Anybody here go to the Kingdom? Oh yeah, you were there, Lauren, and others. There was a huge, for those that were there, it was like, wow. As that kingdom went down, it just sent debris everywhere. Why? Because all of a sudden you have huge solid thing displacing a bunch of air. And it created the huge wind that threw that debris all over downtown Seattle. Imagine hundreds of thousands of square miles of land coming up out of the water. And as that land's coming up out of the water, it's displacing air. The foundations of the deep and the windows of the heaven were also stopped. And the rain from heaven was restrained. Because as soon as it did that, now the earth is again sitting down in the mantle. There's not much water left underneath the earth, but there is water. Walt Brown has theorized that there is still water underneath all the mountain ranges of the earth. They've done a recent discovery underneath the Himalayan mountain range that they said that by their conductivity measurements, there must be brackish aqueous solution underneath the Himalayan mountain range. There is a deficiency of gravity underneath every mountain range. Why? Because water weighs less than rock. And they're shocked because they can measure gravity, which is based on mass, and if they assume that the height of the mountain is rock mountain all the way down to the center of the earth, there should be the same density and the gravity associated with that density. But they find out that there's not as much because there's water underneath the mountain ranges. And so there's a gravity deficiency. And the waters receded continually from the earth. At the end of the 150 days, the waters decreased. And Job says, the book of Job says, or who shut in the sea with doors when it burst forth and issued from the womb? Was the door that shut when the crust came to a stop and the tips of where the water had been coming out at the tips of the crack sat down in the mantle as the mantle popped up, shutting the doors, not letting any more of the subterranean water out? When I fixed my limit for it and set bars and doors, when I said, this far you may come, but no further, and here your proud waves must stop. Psalm 104 says, verse 5, you who laid the foundations of the earth, so that it should not be moved forever. you covered it, the earth, with the deep. As with a garment, the waters stood above the mountains. The flood occurred. God's saying, hey, the flood occurred. The psalmist is saying the flood occurred, and at your rebuke, they, the waters, fled. At your voice of your thunder, they hastened away. They went up and over the mountains. Now, the psalmist is saying, you flooded the earth. At your rebuke, the water started going up and over the mountains. Well, now, water doesn't go up and over mountains unless it's doing so because the mountains are crushing and water is running off of this continent, and it would have gone up, off of the highest mountain, like the Rocky Mountains, heading west, and it would have been washing all the way over to the west coast, all the way over to the east coast, rapidly running off of the continent. And any broken pieces of crust or other items would have been going for a ride, a rock tumbling effect as they were running off of the rising continent. They went up and over the mountains. They went down into the valleys to the place which you founded for them. They went down into the valleys in the place you founded for them. You have set a boundary that they may not pass over, that they may not return to cover the earth. These are solid chunks of granite, crustal granite, that have been rock tumbled sitting, and I think this is in Australia. These things are found all over the earth. In fact, if you go down on Interstate 15 down from Marietta down to San Diego, you'll see on the sides these massive granite boulders that are rounded off on the side of the road. When I drive down that road, I go, thank you, Jesus. I know how those granite boulders got there. They got there, they probably came from Colorado and just up and over the mountains and just came crashing down and rock tumbling as they went. How do you explain that at 13,000 feet in the Andes Mountains in Peru, that there are petrified giant oysters? Some would say aliens dropped them there. And there's other pictures. You can do giant oysters, Andes Mountains, see other pictures on a web search. How did they get there? This was an area that did not receive, for whatever reason, did not get some of the sediment that was coming, or it washed off. At the recently laid sediments of the earth washed off as the crust of the Andes, as the Andes Mountains was coming up, as South America was crushing to the west, these giant oysters that were sitting on the bottom, they grew to 13,000 feet. And then are sitting there for us to find. And another example that can be found, the sedimentary layers in the area of the Grand Canyon. They've studied the Grand Canyon probably more than any other canyon in the world, and there's partially uplifted, formerly horizontal layers. And this one is a quartzite layer. This guy right here is a quartzite layer. And it's partially uplifted. These layers stayed horizontal, but they went for a ride. When the train stopped, the horizontal layers went for a ride, but some of it uplifted. And that caused that quartzite, that's a quartzite rock embedded in those horizontal layers. Looking again, how did that block of quartzite, how did this block of quartzite that was in that previous layer, how did it come from this layer and then be displaced to the side of it? Easy to explain with the hydroplate theory, very difficult for others. Okay, and this is George Hess's animation, and let it roll. And that's why we're living in a very seismic area. When we crashed up and over the Pacific Ridge, there's imbalances that are still there. There's trapped water underneath our mountains. There's trapped magma underneath our mountains. And we're in an extremely seismic area. Why is it, and people wonder, why is it that they call this area the Ring of Fire? And I've been watching earthquakes on a daily basis. This is from the USGS earthquake site. I've been watching and plotting actually on a database the number of global earthquakes just to keep an eye on it. And the size of these squares are the magnitude of the quakes. The color of the squares is how soon they've been, whether one within the last hour, within the last day, or within the last week. But always you see this number of earthquakes or greater that are concentrated here. Why? Because everything, according to Walt Brown's theory, everything came crashing there. And that's where there's still instabilities of this Earth. This Earth is still trying to get round. It's trying to get rid of all the imbalances associated with these crustal changes that occurred a few thousand years ago. As soon as everything crashes up, it's sitting on top of the mantle, and it wants to sink in the mantle. But the mantle is putty. It's not water, so it can't sink immediately. And so over the years, it's been sinking down, and we know, people wonder, how did animals get from this island? How did the Galapagos Island finches get stranded there? How did animals get from one continent to another? Because they were all connected. This is immediately after the flood. This is probably what the Earth looked like. And because there's shallow areas and everything you can tell is connected, it would have been easy for people and animals to get from one place to the other. Over the years, the mountains sank down into the mantle, causing this effect to occur as you watch. And again, this is based on actual areas of the Earth that are relatively shallow. We can't appreciate it because we just see ocean. We don't see the shallow areas. And so now we're in this condition where, we're separated by a large amount of ocean waters, and so that also would have occurred had this been the way we got to where we are today. As the waters ran off, any place that would have been this huge basin with earthen dams would have created a huge lake. As the waters ran off, if there was a dam, it would create a huge lake. Dr. Brown spent a year in the area of the Grand Canyon. He found evidence going through the deserts of Utah, Arizona, Colorado, and New Mexico. He saw evidence of water all at the same elevation everywhere along there. And then theorized, at one time there used to be a lake, and he named it Grand Lake, and now this is very popularized by other Christian organizations, but they never say that Walt Brown did the research. And it's for reasons I am baffled by. But then if this dam broke right here, what would you have created? You would have created that. And not by that little old Colorado River running for millions and millions of years through all these layers. You would have had one mother of a flood as the dam broke and the billions of gallons of water washed from the Grand Lake through this gorge of freshly laid down sedimentary rock, creating the Grand Canyon. There's a law of physics that any spinning sphere wants to spin where the greatest mass is at the equator. So when this crustal change was happening on the Earth, all of a sudden it was spinning before the flood. It was spinning in an orientation that had the greatest mass at the center of the Earth, or at the equator. Because the crust went on a big ride, then the upheaving mountain ranges, every mountain range that popped up is now wanting to get to the equator. So the mountain ranges in the southern hemisphere, they're wanting to move the Earth up north. The mountain ranges in the northern hemisphere, they want to move the Earth south. And they're competing for each other, but the most massive mountain range on the Earth is the Himalaya mountain range. And so it was the predominant force wanting to roll the Earth from the north, where the Himalaya mountain range was much closer up to the North Pole when this crushing effect happened. That mountain range wants to move down south, wants to roll the Earth. So that means that here's now, because of the equator of this shotgun shot, that white dot is where this ball wants to be, the North Pole. So I can spin this ball in any orientation, and this ball will want to make that white dot the North Pole. Now it still spins with the axis in the exact same place, but the ball is actually rolling on the ice, and it's going to ultimately roll to the point where that white dot is again the North Pole. Either that or physics is changing. And it's just a simple fact. Now, what can throw this off is, again, the unbalance effect, which it's wobbling because we didn't perfectly counterbalance what he was doing. But the Earth wants to do this too, by the way. It wants to wobble because of our imbalances. It ultimately gets down to the point where all those forces work together, and we will see that that thing goes to the North Pole. And while it's doing that, I wanted to also say, as the Earth is bulged because of the centrifugal force, people on the equator are traveling 1,000 miles an hour. And there's a centrifugal force associated with that. because it's 24,000 miles circumference, goes once in 24 hours, so it's 1,000 miles an hour. So if the Earth is going to roll as a result of what we've been talking about and the crustal changes, if it's going to roll, then the bulge, just like this, it's rolling. Well, the bulge doesn't want to be where it was. The bulge wants to be at the new equator. But the Earth doesn't want that bulge to go to someplace else because something's going to have to rip to make it happen. Does everybody see that? The bulge is going to have to do something to the Earth to grow to that new place. And Dr. Brown theorizes that 90 East Ridge is where, when the Earth rolled, that 90 East Ridge is the scar on this planet of where that bulge grew from where it was to where it is today. Because it had to rip the Earth to get to where it is today. Now, I knew this before the Sumatra quake. Saturday night when the Sumatra quake happened at the end of 2004, it was a Saturday night, I remember, because the last thing I did after getting ready for the Sunday service is I checked my earthquake map, and I go, whoa, there was a major earthquake, which in all the years I'd been watching earthquakes had never happened at the very northern tip of the 90 East Ridge. And I even wrote a letter to Walt Brown saying, Walt, look, the north end of the 90 East Ridge just had a massive earthquake. Why did that earthquake happen? Because the Earth rolled and it's wanting to stretch and make that bulge, but when it stopped doing its roll, there would have been stresses built up where it wants to rip a little bit further, but it doesn't have the force to. Over the years, all the earthquakes and everything else that's happening apparently caused that ridge to just boom, and it ripped. Does this explain why the earthquake caused a 700-mile-long uplifting of the ocean floor?
December 2004. Their combined expertise has successfully pieced together the evidence from the bottom of the ocean. They've ruled out giant underwater landslides, and in a scientific first, observed uplift on the ocean floor of almost 40 feet.
This has changed everybody. I had no idea that we would actually see these really big displacements in the ditch. I thought we might see some faulting and maybe some rubble, but I had no idea that we'd see these big displacements, so it was fabulous. We measured ranges of displacement, sometimes 3 meters to 12 at one point, and we know that this displacement happened in many locations all along the margin. And it started further south, and then like a zipper, it just opened up all the way up the northern coast.
It's a discovery that has changed our understanding of the creation of these giant waves.
Anyway, as soon as I saw that, even there's guys here today that on the Sunday, when we heard about the tsunami, I told the guys, it's probably uplifted on the ocean floor. We heard that there was they were thinking it was a landslide. Nope, it's not going to be a landslide. And they have footage of where it vertically lifted 700 miles along the side. Huge tsunami occurred as a result of it. They think it's going to happen off of the west coast. It's not going to, because the 90 East Ridge was formed from a different phenomena. And there's one other video that let's watch. There's still liquid magma underneath our crust. So when the Denali earthquake happened in Alaska, we had a micro earthquake in Lake Union. Lake Union shook. And this is footage from November 2002, Como TV.
And it was just going kabam, kabam, kabam.
That's one of the eyewitness accounts on Lake Union, where houseboats suddenly rocked so violently that water and sewage lines snapped in two.
So the whole thing shifted, actually quite a bit of distance.
Floating homes were rocking differently than any of these homeowners ever witnessed before.
Not this up and down
Right,
you would get if a boat
like
came
this.
through here. And so we just didn't, it was very disorienting. And then we realized that it was the water going this way.
And seismologists say they could blame the Alaska quake. While it didn't generate a tsunami, energy waves traveling through water could indeed slosh Lake Union.
You do get this very low frequency motion, very slow up and down, and that can cause bodies of water to sort of slosh, a little bit like in a bathtub.
Seismologists say there are similar reports from Lake Pontchartrain in New Orleans and from nuclear power plants as far away as Minnesota, where tonight they're asking the same questions heard on Lake Union.
And then looked out to say, what is happening here?
Okay, now the seismologist said that by the earthquake waves, that it could slosh Lake Union, thousands of miles away. Okay, it didn't slosh any of the lakes between Denali and Lake Union, just Lake Union. And just Lake Pontchartrain, where it snapped 1-inch mooring lines on huge lots in Lake Pontchartrain in Louisiana, it changed the intensity and the frequency of geysers in Yellowstone National Park. Now, how could that happen? Again, if there is still trapped water and liquid magma of the crust coming to a crashing halt at the end of what Dr. Brown calls the compression event, there would have been liquid magma and water trapped underneath our crust. You have this huge Denali earthquake, what was it, 7.9, 8-pointer, 7.9. It's like pressing down your brake pedal on your car, bang, on a hydraulic system. Now you press your brake pedal down, and what happens? The weak spots in your hydraulic system, your slave cylinders on your brakes, they move, and they put your brakes on. And so what does that mean? Lake Union is a bad place to live. Because there is liquid, and they pressed down in Alaska, and the hydraulic effect went underneath the continent, and it found a couple of significant weak places, Louisiana and Lake Union, and punched just those. And so that means in a more severe earthquake, you would have the trapped pressure underneath the crust. If it breaks the crust above or in the area of Lake Union, you would have this tremendous disaster that would occur if you could actually break this area, Lake Pontchartrain or Yellowstone, pop the magma underneath Yellowstone. So looking at a map, you see that the Denali earthquake, and the scientists investigated the timing of it. Yachts in New Orleans, Lake Pontchartrain, snapped line. We had a guest here that lived in Lake Pontchartrain at the time. He says the lake just looked like a bathtub that you just shook up. It says, one scientist commented, every time we drill a hole, we find the unexpected. That's exciting but disturbing. And a science reporter remarked, the COLA, a deep drilling project, revealed how far from true scientific theory, evolution scientific theory, can roam. And they're shocked by what they find. It totally supports Dr. Brown's theory of how we got to where we are. Genesis 8 and 4, if you read the rest, we're going to have to just cover these as a review next week of these chapters, verses out of Genesis. But let's do one closing verse and going to Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 24, and then we'll close. And it says in verse 19, the earth is violently broken. The earth is split open. The earth is shaken exceedingly. The earth shall reel to and fro like a drunkard, and shall totter like a hut. Its transgression shall be heavy upon it, and it shall fall and not rise again. It shall come to pass in that day that the Lord will punish on high the host of exalted ones. The host of the exalted ones is Satan. God will punish Satan and destroy him. But the earth is headed for another cataclysm. There's judgment by fire, as we mentioned from the book of Peter. The unleashing of forces still underneath our crust are going to cause the earth to reel again. And the earth is going to wobble a lot more, according to the scriptures, because of these kind of energies that are placed still underneath the crust.